with MP Viersen for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Zhu, if I can start with questioning you, we've just finished up a study on our new capstone organization that's being proposed, and we've had a chance to hear from professionals across the research field. This study that we're starting today will help define Canada's criteria for pursuit of excellence. I'm just curious if there was anything else that you wanted to share that you may not have had time to in your opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Viersen. So firstly, as I mentioned, EDR, I think, is a major problem. Another big problem is the lack of ideological diversity within Canadian academia, which is not a problem which is unique to Canada, of course. Academics all across the world tend to be more progressive, and there are many reasons for this. Some of them perhaps perfectly understandable. However, I think it is fair to say that within Canadian academia, there is a monoculture where if you deviate even very slightly from what is fashionable and what is commonly accepted by your peers, not only will you be ostracized, very often you will not be able to have an academic career in the first place. So unfortunately, when I advise my students, I have to tell them, if you are in any way not progressive, you have to hide your views until you actually have at least a PhD acceptance, because otherwise you will never get ahead.
Dr. Zhu, we're going to have to ask you to hold for a minute because the interpreters are having trouble. They can't hear you. So what do we do now?
Maybe Mr. Viersen has another question for another witness.
Okay, so since there's trouble with Dr. Zhu, would you be able to ask a question of another witness, or I'll just stop your time here?
Yes, please. Do you want to just sort out his mic situation?
We did have trouble with him coming on. We were hoping it was fixed. Do we want to ask him to keep speaking and see if we can resolve it? It won't. No? I'm sorry. I think it seems like they've lost it. It was a bit shaky coming.
All right.
I'm sorry about that. I've stopped your time, so if you want to collect your thoughts and think about a question for someone else for a minute.
Okay. Well, I'll move to Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Kaufman, when your time ran out, you were just starting to address a topic that's interesting to me, the CBC. If you wanted to just continue your remarks from there, I may collect my thoughts to provide me with a question. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I was just sort of drawing this analogy between what's happened to trust in media in the U.S., trust in media is very low on the right. I mean, Republicans have very low trust in media. They have very low trust in academia now. In Canada, the trust in media on the right is very low. I think the trust in academia, which is coming down, has a potential to go where it is in the United States. Now, I just want to pick up on some of what Yuan Yizhu was just talking about, that when we think about the way the councils work, I mean, the allocation of funds comes from academic experts who are, because they're drawn from academia, they're going to reflect the perspectives of academia, which is a good thing in terms of quality, but in terms of ideology, I mean, just to echo a couple of studies we have, there was a study on Canada by Chris Dummett and Zach Patterson, I believe, which came out last year, which showed that 88% of Canadian academics identifies on the left. Work I've done, surveys I've done show that number to be around 75% or thereabouts, with only about 5% conservative. That slant. Now, the other thing is people who are active, who take an active role in setting policy, tend to be even further left. If they're in the humanities and social sciences, and particularly if they're active in anything to do with policy, I think they were even going to be even further left. So what we're getting is the furthest most left point, roughly, of public opinion, which is having an outsized role in setting the agenda here. And it's a valid, look, I'm saying this is if you believe that mirroring the Canadian population by race and sex is the most important thing, and it's more important than excellence, fine. That's a perfectly valid worldview. But what I'm trying to stress is this is not the worldview of most Canadians who pay tax, who support the research enterprise. And the more that the tri-councils move in this direction, they're already in this direction, and also the more you have things like diversity statements where on your application you can signal your adherence to cultural socialism or DEI, that is going to also lead to political discrimination. And political discrimination is a real thing. So just another survey fact, in surveys I did, about 45% of Canadian academics would not hire a known Trump supporter for an academic job. In the US, it's 40%. In Britain, a third won't hire a known Brexit supporter. Now, there could be noise in that data, but roughly speaking, there is significant political bias, and there's been a lot of studies, mainly American, showing sort of bias against any right-leaning grant applications. So a right-leaning grant applications, people openly admit they would mark them down. So we've got a systematic problem, a systematic political bias, I think, in the adjudication and selection processes in these policies. And I'm just wondering what people think that, I mean, are they just going to put their heads in the sand and just go forth business as usual and hope that what's happening in the US will never happen in Canada? I would like to see the councils get ahead of this problem and move to a more colorblind merit approach and to remove political criteria such as mandatory diversity statements. These are not universal consensus values. They are partisan values, and every survey will show a big partisan gap on these questions.
Do you have any specific suggestion on how we would, like, if you were helping to create this new capstone organization, any specific suggestions on some kind of mechanics of that?
I think it's as simple as just removing, first of all, I don't think you should have Canada research chairs that are restricted by race and sex, first of all. I think that's the first thing. Secondly, no diversity statements where people who essentially affirm cultural socialist ideology get higher points. So I think removal of, we've seen Harvard and MIT remove mandatory diversity statements. We've seen the Washington Post editorialize against this. These things should be removed from the application form. So that's at a minimum.
That's our time.
I have. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll now turn to MP Blanchard-Joca for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. Mr. Kaufman, are you aware that there is evidentiary proof that there is this type of situation for academic research in universities, what you were referring to, DEI?
DEI in universities, I'm commenting on the Canadian Research Councils, the Canada Research Chairs, for example, that have restricted hiring to particular racial and sexual groups. I'm commenting on the diversity statements, where if you affirm your commitment to DEI, your application is rated more favorably. That's sort of what I'm talking about in terms of applying ideology to the allocation of research. Now, I think I don't know if I've answered your question, if I understood it correctly. Maybe I should have kept it in French rather than going to the translation. But what I would say is that you can't, just because people say, don't vote for there's the definition of what is political, right? What I'm saying is when you talk about how will you promote diversity and equity in your research? That is political. Just because you say don't say how will you promote voting for the Liberal Party. The definition of political is not narrowly focused upon party politics. Political ideologies. I mentioned that survey data shows very clearly that attitudes to DEI divide very heavily based on who you vote for and how you identify on a left-right axis. That means they are political. So I think this is a bit of semantics, what we've heard, really, the idea that this isn't political. It very much is.
Right.
So I hope I've answered
Oui, ça répond à la question.
Yes, that does answer my question. Can you tell us if there is any linkage between DEI and scientific merit?
So I used the example of this study where we looked at number of publications times the number of times they're cited. That is the standard H-index metric that is used for research assessment, and I'm willing to defend that, by the way. What we saw in the Nature paper of 2024 was very clearly that female and Hispanic or Black academics controlling for number of years in profession and for discipline had substantially lower output than white and Asian or male, academics. I think it is reasonable to surmise, although I'm open to other data. I want to see data on this and scientific proof. I believe that by pursuing EDI, you are reducing research output. I would bet on that. Now, is it the biggest factor? No, it's a factor. It's going to reduce it a certain amount, and maybe that's a trade people are willing to make. Maybe they think, okay, equity and diversity is a more important factor, or let's just say we were going to have 20% or 30% equity and diversity, and we're willing to sacrifice a certain amount of research output. But I'm not sure that the Canadian taxpayer is willing to fund that and support those values. Those values are, of course, backed because, if 75% of academia is on the left, they're setting these policies. To them, this is natural and not political. I get it, but they are in a bubble. That bubble, how many academics vote for the Conservative Party? It's very small. I mentioned 10%.
Monsieur Kaufman.
So I don't think...
Mr. Kaufman, I'd just like to continue my questions. Is there any opposition to DEI and the pursuit of scientific truth?
Opposition to DEI? Sorry, opposition to DEI or... Sorry, could you repeat it?
I'll repeat. The establishment of criteria for DEI and the establishment of scientific truths. Is there any opposition between these two?
Yes, I believe that they are in opposition. I think that if they weren't in opposition, a purely colorblind merit-based hiring would, you're going to get some diversity through a colorblind merit-based program. The fact you have to rig it means you are going to compromise on excellence and scientific truth in order to achieve cultural socialism or EDI. So I think they are in tension fundamentally. It doesn't mean you're going to get no, it's probably just going to result in a tax on your scientific research and pursuit of truth. It's not going to kill it. But I think that the values of the general public that supports research are what should prevail, not the values of academics, I'm afraid, or at least the vocal academics who wind up participating in these committees.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il y a des solutions
Thank you. Are there solutions you might recommend to maintain high standards in scientific research, given the atmosphere you've described?
Yeah, I would recommend, first of all, going with a colorblind approach which does not advertise grants or positions by race or sex. I would recommend removing any statements that require you to affirm cultural socialism or DEI in order to get higher points. Those are two simple recommendations. I think those would improve research excellence. They would also help to restore public faith. And if particularly, the half of the country that isn't on the same side as most academics, if they go against the research enterprise, that's going to damage research the way it's damaged belief in the CBC and mainstream media. So I think that's just a bad way for academia to go if we care about the research base and research funding.
Brown, and we'll start that with MP Kitchen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. It's greatly appreciated. And Dr. Zhu, I understand you can hear us, but unfortunately we can't hear from you, and I appreciate you being able, so I do appreciate any statements or anything from this conversation that you might be able to add from your point of view. Ultimately, it's interesting. We're now looking at a study on federal funding of research excellence. The study we just finished, which was dealing with the capstone issue and research, and we had the Tri-Council here just on Tuesday, as well as NRC, and I asked them at that time basically a very simple question of what their goal was, which is based on individual merit of, one, the scholars applying for the funding, and two, the quality of their proposed research. And they agreed with that. That's what it, and Dr. Kerr, you made that statement today when you talked about discovery grants, et cetera. Those are there. Dr. Zhu talked about similar aspects, and we didn't hear all of it, but I think he would agree with that. But he also talked about the buzzwords. And the concern is, and when we look at issues such as DEI and this aspect of it, and these buzzwords that people want to hear, the concern we have is what we're hearing from researchers around the country who believe that everything that when they apply for that research is based on those 2 points, those 2 goals. And yet they're finding that there's a third one in there, which is this DEI, which steps in the way of what they're presenting when it should be based on what their quality of research is. And Dr. Kerr, your point is, which if that person isn't knowledgeable in that area, then they shouldn't be doing that research. But that's where the funding should go. And we get a lot of crossover from basic natural sciences to healthcare sciences to even to social sciences, how there might be some overlap. And so there can be some crossover there. But how do we ensure that when it's done, that the people that are making this decision on federal funding and providing that funding for excellent research, how do we, when we're talking about federal money, which we are responsible for, ensure that it's based on those 2 principles and not something else? Dr. Kerr?
Thank you for that question, and I do indeed fully believe and support the idea that excellence should be the defining criteria here. But let me just say there is a third category that is practically universally present within granting evaluation, and that is the quality of the training program. That's part of it as well. So there are 2 points that I will very quickly try to make in response. The first is that sometimes this was commented on by a colleague witness here. We want to include a recognition of diversity under some circumstances, that is to say, when it is appropriate, in research design. I will give you an example for why this can sometimes be absolutely vital. Everybody's car has airbags these days. Those airbags are adaptive. That is to say, the weight of the person in the front seat and the proximity of that person to the airbag determines how strong those airbags will explode onto you if you're in a collision. When those airbags first came out, they tended to kill small women. The reason for this is that the research that was done was, and on children I will add, the reason that this is true is that the research done to back this up was basically done on young men. The initial proposition around airbags was protect 25-year-old and under young men who don't wear seatbelts. Well, the result of not including gender in the consideration here was simply that you killed a lot of people who really didn't need to die. So it can be very appropriate for research design to consider aspects of diversity. The other part, however, is the training program, and that's where the...
And I apologize for interrupting because we're limited on time. And I understand that aspect because that's the research. And that person designing that research hopefully is looking at, and sometimes it gets missed. And I get that part. And I think the public gets that part. But that is not necessarily what the DEI is about. It's a question of whether that research was given to an individual researcher because they meet that DEI quality or standard, as opposed to the quality of their research. Because when we're dealing with the research, the quality of the research, one would like to think, is covering all of that aspect. So it's a huge challenge along those lines to do. I get that. And we get where we need to understand that with our researchers and providing it. And that is when those committees are looking at, but the committee should be making that decision based on the quality of the research and the presentation of that research, as opposed to it being presented based on buzzwords that might meet certain standards. But I appreciate that. Dr. Kaufman.
Time. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we will turn to MP Diab for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madame la Présidente. Okay, let me start with one question to Mr. Kaufman and then ask Professor Kerr a follow-up. Earlier on in our mandate in this committee, we've undertaken many studies, but one of which was a study on Indigenous traditional knowledge, something I'd never really experienced on my own. I'm not a researcher. but I have family members that have done research and have done PhDs in various categories. But the Indigenous traditional knowledge was a new one on me. We learned at that point about different kinds of knowledge that are not in the mainstream and how they can help us cover more areas of research with a better depth of understanding. I certainly felt that way in any case after doing. I guess the question to you is based on what you have, you are just testifying. Do you not think these are valuable perspectives to learn from, that these communities sort of don't kind of deserve to have a say? They're certainly not the mainstream. And I know we talk buzzwords. English is not my first language, so I'm not sure I agree with a lot of the terminology that I'm hearing in this. It's not something that I'm used to, but some of these perspectives are obviously, we would have never heard about them if we were just going to go with, your typical, let's be honest, white man doing research. So, go ahead.
Well, first thing to say is I don't think it would just be white men if you had a merit-based competition. That's very clearly, I just think that's a bit of a straw man. On Indigenous knowledge, I think there's plenty to learn, but I think that if it is of value to science, then it'll form part of science. If it is folklore, it'll be studied by folklorists. I do not think there should be any special dispensation for Indigenous knowledge, and I actually think that those people who would try and elevate Indigenous knowledge to the same level as science, sort of falsifiable, measurable, testable, Popperian science, I think are actually a threat to the pursuit of truth. So I think I have to say that I find this idea that we can put Indigenous knowledge, just because it's Indigenous, on the same level as scientific knowledge that has been accrued through the scientific method, to be deeply counter-enlightenment and against the mission of what should be the mission of the councils, and against what the public would support. I don't think this is something that should be in the university unless it is in accord with science. So it may be that there are certain medicines that and scientific knowledge about medicines that are informed by Indigenous knowledge. So in that sense, great. But should we have any special dispensation or affirmative action to get those perspectives in? No, I don't think so.
Okay, listen, I appreciate your perspective. I'm going to say I don't agree with it, but that's my perspective as well. And I'll let another, perhaps MP, follow up on that if they so wish. Let me now ask Professor Kerr. I know you're a professor of biology, but you're also you talked about discovery grants and evaluation of grants and so on. So not only do you deal with researchers, but you're also dealing with students. So given your experience, what happens really if we don't have diversity and inclusion consideration in some of these fundings? For example, for women, for example, for people that don't speak English as their first or even second language, people of different ethnic backgrounds. I'd just like to hear from your perspective.
We're less good at discovery. This is what happens when you leave half your team on the sidelines and you only play the other half. I have had a great privilege over my career of having a very diverse group. I don't apply litmus tests of any sort beyond interest in stuff that I do and capacity to do that stuff. My experience has been that accounting for the ways in which people have different lived experiences than me makes my research program stronger. I'm not here to talk about my research, but I could quite easily point to what are, by the H index, my most influential publications, had I not been somebody who thought carefully about how to include people who looked and experienced things very differently than me. Those publications would never have happened. And there are some, again, I'm not here to talk about myself, but, some of those papers have been influential. And with a monolithic team, it's less good.
Hearing about your experience, which is why you're here today. So I personally would like to hear that.
That's our time. Perhaps Dr. Kerr can submit an expanded answer in writing. We always accept those. Thank you. So now we will turn to MP Blanchet-Jacquat for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. For Mr. Kaufman, in 2023, the Supreme Court of the United States prohibited discrimination in terms of, and that led to diversity, inclusion, and equality. There were two bills that were brought through the House of Representatives. What do you think of the path that was taken by our neighbours to the south, and what should the path be here in terms of DEI?
I think I'm very much in favor of the approach of outlawing affirmative action that's been taken, advocated by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Students for Fair Admissions case, which, let's not forget, was brought principally on because of Asian Americans who were being discriminated against. Because let's remember, the flip side of really what affirmative action is a euphemism for discrimination against certain groups, Asians, whites, males, essentially. I mean, there's also discrimination against conservatives, but that's not happening through affirmative action. What I would say is you look at that decision, that's been supported by not just a majority of white Americans, but a majority of Hispanic Americans and a majority of black Americans and of Asian Americans. This is a consensus value. There have been a number of referenda in California to try and reintroduce affirmative action because it's been repealed by a popular initiative, and every time they try it, it's always voted down because the public does not want racial preferences in the allocation, whether it be university places at Harvard or whether it be research grants. That's against the values. I mentioned in the Canadian survey, 59% want a colorblind approach versus only 29% for a color-conscious approach. And yet, what is the approach that's being pursued? A color-conscious approach in the Tri-Council. So I think it is out of step with public opinion. They may be able to get away with it for a little longer, but ultimately, I don't think that this is going to do the research body any good.
Mr. Kaufman, there's some evidence about the unexpected consequences have led to misogynistic approaches. What do you think can be done to avoid this in terms of DEI?
Just a short answer.
Well, I think misogynistic approaches are, they're contrary to the idea of judging individuals as individuals and not by their gender. So I just think a classical liberal merit-based approach where we're judging strictly on the basis of the individual is more than sufficient. Gender discrimination is against the law. It's also against the classical liberal position. I would also add that the research on...
That's our time. You can always expand on your answer in writing if you care to. So thank you.